Welcome to our Profiles in Leadership series here at Penn State Dickinson Law. The series offers an unparalleled opportunity to glean insights from top leaders who serve in government, education, the private sector, and civil society. In each episode, we invite these leaders to reflect on their journey and share skills, core values, and qualities that make them the leaders they are today. Today, we are very pleased to have Joe Allen. Joe is Executive Director of the Bayh-Dole Coalition. He is a leader in national efforts to foster public-private sector R&D partnerships. He was the key staffer securing the passage of the Bayh-Dole Act, opening up collaborations between research universities and the US industry. The Economist Technology Quarterly called this act possibly the most inspired piece of legislation to be enacted in America over the past half-century. Joe wants to promote and defend policies allowing public and private R&D partnerships and to develop new products, companies, and jobs, growing prosperity around the globe through a strong intellectual property system. Joe was previously the Executive Director of the Intellectual Property Owners, Inc., Director of the Office of Technology Commercialization at the US Department of Commerce, President of the National Technology Transfer Center, and the lead witness in South Africa helping secure the passage of their Bayh-Dole Act. Amidst all of this, he has also found the time to pen a periodic post with IP Watchdog, and I commend that to you. So welcome, Joe.
Well, thank you very much. It sounds like after your introduction, I can't hold a job very long.
Well, it's been such a fascinating journey, and I'm looking forward to exploring and distilling some of the leadership lessons that you have for our listeners today. So let's start with your thoughts on the current state of public-private R&D partnerships. How far have we progressed?
Amazingly, just in my lifetime, what just happened with COVID-19, actually just 3 years ago, is unbelievable. I mean, it was really like a World War II type mobilization, but it was actually even faster than we got things going in World War II. And the fact that our public and private sectors came together in the midst of a global pandemic. I mean, when most people were staying home, afraid to go out and do anything, our universities, our federal laboratories, and our industry came together seamlessly to try to develop. Remember, when the COVID pandemic broke out, there were really no therapies. There was really nothing to treat it. It was new, and the fact that we came together and actually developed vaccines in months as opposed to years is phenomenal. And that was really done, frankly, because of the confidence that things like the Bayh-Dole Act inspired an industry that government, in fact, could be a reliable research partner. And contrary to what some people think, industry paid most of the price of developing our therapies. A lot of companies lost money in that. Some made money. There's nothing wrong with that. But if you went back to 2020, what would you have paid for an effective vaccine to be able to get out of your house and go back to work and shop again and have your kids back in school? And the other thing is, the rest of the world was looking to us. I mean, there were Chinese and Russian vaccines, but Lord help the people that had to use them. So you really had the world looking at the United States saying, hey, listen, save us. And we did. And I think that is a tremendous compliment. Now, the shame of it is, at the same time we did that, our underlying system that made that possible has never been under more attack. I mean, I really thought after that, people say, this is incredible. Look at what just happened. It's literally a miracle. It was a miracle. And rather than that, we have people, determined to tear the system down. So, it's ironic that you have something working right in front of your eyes. I don't think many people miss the COVID-19 pandemic. I don't know where you could have been where it didn't affect you. But unfortunately, it just shows that we have to keep educating people over and over again, because we can't assume people know how the underlying system works. They really don't. And anyway, I think to answer your question, I think that public and private partnerships have never been stronger, but they've also never been more fragile because our system is very delicate and it really depends on confidence. If you really can't trust the other party, I don't care what the laws say. If it looks like they can just change on a whim, then companies are not going to take the risk. And our system is based on companies taking risk. So, we can discuss later how that works. So again, I'm very hopeful that it's clear our system operates. Other countries in the world have recognized that. But unfortunately, at home, there's a lot of people who really don't appreciate it. And unfortunately, there's a determined minority who have made it their life's work to actually send us back to the pre-Bayh-Dole era. So we have our work cut out for us. This is obviously something that means a lot to me because it's not just my personal time, but I think it literally depends on the future of this country, whether we keep our public-private partnerships going or not. And the or not is a very grim alternative.
All right. So what I'm hearing, Joe, is that we rallied together in light of COVID. And what has happened since is that kind of bond that we had is slowly unraveling. Is that your sense of what's happening?
Well, it actually goes back before that because, the Bayh-Dole Act, while as you said, the Economist Technology Quarterly says, one of the most significant laws passed in the last half century, it works very quietly. It doesn't have a lot of fanfare. It doesn't have a lot of bureaucracy. So it gets ignored. And there are people who are philosophically opposed to it. And those people are working constantly to get another agenda going forward. So I think a lot of it really is that a lot of folks just don't, even on Capitol Hill, don't understand how our system works. They don't understand the patent system that underlies Bayh-Dole. And I think that one of the reasons we'll get into talk about the Bayh-Dole Coalition, a lot of us just realize, hey, listen, we can't just take for granted that people are going to support this because we have to go back and actually do the hard groundwork to re-explain how our system operates, why it works the way it does, and frankly, how it benefits people.
So is the lack of trust that you sense more because of lack of education, or is there something else going on?
Well, if we can talk about how Bayh-Dole evolved, but there really are different schools of thought, and they're different. It's almost a religious philosophy. Some people really, really believe that if the government pays for any research, it should be freely available to everybody. And that actually was the US policy before Bayh-Dole. And it sounds very noble, but the problem is that the government is not developing products. It's funding mainly basic research, particularly at universities and federal laboratories. That's the role that we set it out in the Roosevelt administration, when they decided to start the National Science Foundation, and in fact, to really have the government fund research at universities and federal labs, which it really wasn't doing before World War II. That was a conscious decision. What happened was that we followed that policy, and it became apparent very early on that when inventions were made, they were not being developed because no one is going to spend their own time and money developing something if everyone else owns it. I mean, it's just a fundamental principle. So even back, we'll talk about the Bayh-Dole Coalition. I hate to keep jumping back and forward, but one thing that we've done is we've started finding the original documents going back to President Roosevelt, how our system was built. And we had, President Roosevelt started this thing. Even back in Roosevelt's times, there was an exception where people said, okay, if it looks like the best way to get something commercialized is to have the inventor own it, they can petition the government. So even in the very beginning, the basis was, okay, if the government funds any percentage of research and invention comes out, anyone can use it for free. Now, remember, in 1945, the US was the only functioning economy virtually in the world. Europe was destroyed. Asia was destroyed. We didn't have any competition. And I think it was very noble that we said, okay, we want to help people economically and we want to help people scientifically. So we're going to give this technology away. We're going to give the research away. What started happening was, as I said, it became apparent that inventions were being made and they weren't going anywhere. They were just sitting on the shelf. So President Roosevelt, like I said, had a waiver process. President Kennedy, when he came in 15 years later, elected in 1960, actually made a presidential memorandum saying, okay, we're going to make it easier for people to get inventions they made with federal funding. But you have to have a system for going forward. And if you're not commercializing them, the government can march in and take their rights back away. In other words, we want to make sure this is actually turning into something useful, not just a science paper. And the Kennedy process started working. President Nixon came in a couple of years later and modified the Kennedy process so it actually became even more liberal. Again, the whole idea being we're running the experiment, but we're seeing that just having things that everyone owns it for free, no one is developing these products because they're more like early stage ideas than products, and some company has to put their time into it. And we found without patent protection, without the ability to protect your investment, companies weren't doing that. So that sort of started the process going in 1968. Now, again, we started back in 1945, now we're in 1968. President Johnson asked the Comptroller General, how many drugs have been commercialized from NIH funding? Now, NIH is a prime funder of basic life science research. And in that time, they were even more dominant than they are now. The answer came back, no drugs are being commercialized because there's no incentive for companies to develop them. And President Johnson said, this is a waste. We can't afford this. We can't ask taxpayers to be funding research and they're not getting tangible benefits back for what they're doing. So Johnson started a policy at NIH, which was the precursor of Bayh-Dole. And so the policy was if a university had a tech transfer office, in other words, they actually had people who knew how to license inventions, and they got NIH funding, they could qualify for a program that meant that they automatically owned the invention and they could license it for development. The government could use the research for free, same thing as Bayh-Dole. And so what happened was now, as opposed to inventions sitting on the shelf, they started getting commercialized. And we found that the government had 28,000 inventions on the shelf. Only less than 5% were being licensed, which is a very small percentage. Under the NIH program, 30% were being licensed. So clearly something was happening. And that program stayed in place until President Carter got in. And when President Carter got in, he had a secretary overseeing the agency who really felt that, again, if the government funded research, everyone should own it. And he stopped the NIH program. He stopped the university program. It wasn't a statutory program, it was an administrative program. And that's what led to Bayh-Dole. The universities came to Senator Bayh and Senator Dole independently and said, hey, listen, this is a tremendous waste. And of course, now we're talking, now we're into the 70s. Okay, in the 70s, Japan and Germany are back on their feet economically. And they're actually starting to take markets away from the United States. And the other thing is they're taking high technology markets away. Things like automobiles and steel and electronics, where the US has been dominant, suddenly we're not dominant anymore. And in the Japanese in particular, nothing wrong with this. They were frequently acknowledged, listen, we're going to American universities, we're talking to professors there, nothing illegal about it, we're giving the research away. But a lot of our congressional people are saying, we're losing jobs in the Midwest now. What won World War II was our industrial might, our manufacturing capability. Well, when I was on the Senate staff, the Midwest was called the Rust Belt because all those old factories, I'm actually here not far outside of Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh's not a manufacturing center anymore. I mean, it's actually a high technology center, but all those steel mills up and down the Ohio Valley are gone. All those jobs are gone. So what happened was Senator Bayh and Dole, who were opposed to each other, I mean, Bayh's a liberal Democrat, Dole's a conservative Republican, got together and said, hey, listen, we can agree on one thing. We can't ask the American taxpayer to spend billions of dollars in public sector research if nothing's coming out the other end, particularly at a time where it looks like our economy is really on the ropes. So, not to get too far in the story, that's what started Bayh-Dole. But it wasn't just like we had an idea one day. This goes all the way back to President Roosevelt and President Truman and President Kennedy. And they're like, yeah, there's an iteration there. So I think the reason that made Bayh-Dole successful was we had actually run the experiment. For 40 years, we tried the other way. We said, okay, put all these in the public domain. Sounds very noble. I think again, I can't fault the people that in 1945, that seemed like a good thing to do. But by 1980, it was apparent that it just didn't work. And so we could either keep pouring money down a rat hole, or we said, we've got to do something different. And so Bayh-Dole was the first time Congress actually passed pro-patent legislation, probably in 30 years. I was on the Senate Judiciary Committee staff. And when I first got on the Senate Judiciary Committee staff, patents were under the Antitrust and Monopoly Subcommittee. So you can imagine how patents were viewed on the Senate Judiciary Committee. And Bayh and Dole, because they were both on different sides of the aisle, they're both very well respected, were able to change that dynamic and say, listen, we can't keep on doing what we're doing. It's clearly not working. This is being done in an election year, very much like we're going into now. Things are very contentious. But I think both parties said, look, it's clear something's got to change. The American people were as angry as they could be. Actually, the election of 1980 was a house cleaning, but without rambling on too much further, that's really how our policies evolved. And again, it wasn't just somebody coming in off the wall with a theory. We actually had people who had been doing this for 40 years, actually had empirical data on what worked and what didn't work. And that's really what started. But again, there still are people today who don't like patents, who think they're unfair, and who still believe that if the government funds any research, it should be in the public domain, or the government should be in charge of how it's commercialized. And that means if you license something, then the government's going to tell you what to do with it. And again, Bayh-Dole is based on decentralization. The government funds the research. We set up some basic rules. You get the bureaucracy out of the way. Bayh-Dole has no bureaucracy, has no additional funding. It's really based on decentralized management. The other theory is Washington knows best. Washington knows how to do technologies. Washington knows how to pick winners and losers. And we can debate that one later, but there really are two different philosophies. And unfortunately, their philosophy is easier to explain than ours is. So we always have the burden of sort of going back and explaining how commercialization works, what the private sector does, that there's huge risk involved, and most times people lose their money in it. And the final thing I'll add is our system is driven by small companies. 70% of licenses from universities and federal labs go to small companies, not to giant corporations. And if you look at who does breakthrough technologies, look at mRNA. It was licensed to 2 small companies. Moderna made no money for 10 years on mRNA. The woman who actually invented mRNA at the University of Pennsylvania was actually downgraded on campus because she couldn't even get research funding. Her idea seemed so far off the wall. Though Dr. Jim Allison at the University of California, Berkeley, won the Nobel Prize for immunotherapy. He was ignored for 10 years on campus. He was considered a nut. It took the university 10 years to even find a small company licensee. So, people tend to glom on the big successes, but the hard work is done by universities finding a partner. It's very difficult to do. Even people like MIT and Stanford, if you have one person interested in technology, it's amazing. You don't have people competing for it. And our system is driven by small companies who have to get venture funding. Some make it, some don't make it, but that's how our system operates. It's kind of messy, but it's the most efficient system in the world.
Great, thanks. I didn't want to interrupt you because you were on the road, Joe. And I do have a number of follow-up questions.
Okay.
So let's start with the 1940s, the genesis of all of this. One interesting figure is that in the 1960s, the Department of Defense apparently accounted for about 1/3 of all the R&D in the world. And now, there was a whole lot of leveling that had, as a result of that, the internet and all sorts of other good things that came out of that. If instead of the Department of Defense having the bulk of the budget, we had by the folks, they're benefiting now from the Bayh-Dole Act having the bulk of the budget, what would the world look like?
It's impossible to say, but the other thing is when we look back on 1945, that's a world that you and I can't imagine. My parents' generation actually grew up then. So you had people who grew up in the Great Depression. which was much worse than anything we can imagine. A worldwide Great Depression where you had 30% of the population unemployed. I mean, that gave rise to Hitler, and I mean, Hitler. I mean, it was bad. Then that generation went into fight World War II, and of course that was a slugfest. So when they came out of World War II, they went right into the Cold War. So now you're talking about nuclear weapons. So I can certainly understand with that mentality why people said, "Listen, national security." And remember, the other thing is in 1945, the U.S. and the Soviet Union are virtually the last two giants left on the planet. Europe is starving. In 1945, Europe is starving. Britain's starving, Germany's starving, they're decimated, China's decimated, Japan is bombed into rubble. So it was a different world. So I can't criticize people for that, but I think the other thing that was different was back in 1960, a lot of major corporations did their own basic research. So they were less reliant on government for breakthroughs. Now, what started happening is, as time went on in the 70s, companies got away from their own basic research. And I think that's when you had them looking at people like National Science Foundation, NIH as potential partners. But what stopped that was the government policies were, if you were dumb enough to partner with the university and an invention was made, if there was any federal funding involved, the invention would be taken away from you. So we actually had these cultural barriers, as well as, like you said, an emphasis on defense. And again, I can't fault that. In 1945, 50, I mean, I grew up in the Cold War. I remember in elementary school, one of our exercises was to have the kids huddle under their desk and put their hands over their heads in case there was a nuclear attack. I mean, that was real. When I worked in the federal government, I went down to the basement. You had these huge barrels down there of water in case you had to shelter in place if there was a nuclear attack. So it was a different world, but I think we have to appreciate what people did then and then learn the lessons and go on. But the bottom line is, even if you're funding defense, they're always, again, the internet came out of DoD funding. Now, they were looking for a way for scientists to communicate, and they found it. But the genius of Bayh-Dole is it says, okay, go ahead and do that. That's fine. But if there's other applications, then let the people that made the invention go ahead and license them, and actually have them developed. So even if you're just funding defense, you're still going to find other things. I mean, the Department of Defense is actually, Walter Reed Hospital is one of the best medical facilities in the world because it came out of treating veterans and they see all kinds of diseases here. You mentioned I was at the National Technology Transfer Center. We were out at the VA hospital in San Francisco. They were one of the first people that started detecting HIV in the 70s in San Francisco. So, again, I think, we can just debate about where we should be focused, but I think the more critical thing is to make sure that the incentives are there. So when the serendipitous inventions come out, or if you see something like HIV/AIDS, you're able to start working with the private sector and say, hey, listen, something serious is going on here now. We need to come up with a solution, and it can't just be a research paper. We need to work together because, again, the government has certain capabilities, but even NIH and the VA are not going to be developing vaccines and drugs. That's outside their expertise.
Joe, do you have the figure of commercialization? You said it was 5% initially, and then under the NIH program it was 30%. So where are we today?
I would have to defer. There's a thing called the AUTM, Association of University Technology Managers, which surveys their members. I don't want to even estimate that, but we're certainly way over 5%. And I think the other thing that's happened is, which is, it shows how much the system has actually changed. If you went back before Bayh-Dole, you would not find universities included in economic development plans in states and local. They did graduates, but they weren't looked on as an economic engine. Under Bayh-Dole, we spin off 3 new companies and commercialize 3 new products every day of the year. So it's not just licensing now. I think the thing that's really become exciting is universities are become centers of entrepreneurship. Your students want to be entrepreneurs. Stanford had a couple of their students that got a National Science Foundation grant, and they come up with an idea for a search engine. So under Bayh-Dole, the invention was owned by Stanford. They reported it there. Stanford couldn't license the invention. People weren't looking for a new search engine. So the kids came into Stanford and they said, hey, we'd like to start our own company. And Stanford, said, okay, well, we can't find any real interest in it, but if you guys want to start your own company, we'll take an equity. We won't even take a royalty because we frankly think the odds are you're going to fail. That's how Google.
What is it you think, Joe, that
Well,
made
let me just add one thing. That company,
Senators Bayh and Dole step up to the plate to lead
Can I-
this effort?
Can I just finish one thing?
Yeah, go ahead.
That company I mentioned is Google. Okay, nobody wanted to license Google. They couldn't find a single person there. Nobody was looking for a search engine. But I think that's what makes our system works is those two students saw an opportunity that no one else in the world saw. Now the odds of starting Google are pretty small, but they did it. So I'm sorry, I didn't mean to.
That's good. I'm bringing the conversation back to the focus of the leadership issue. So I think it's great that you had the front row seat working with Senators Bayh and Dole. And I think it'll be helpful for our listeners to understand what is it about these two people that made them the leaders in this effort.
That's a great question. They were very different people. Bob Dole was 19 years old in 1945. He was a second lieutenant in Italy. Just a couple weeks before the end of the war, he was actually hit with a German machine gun and left for dead. So he's a guy who lost his right arm. He lost the function of his right arm, came back into the GI Bill, went back to school, and got elected to Congress. Birchby was like a generation later. He came out of the Korean War generation. He was elected in 1962 when President Kennedy was in office. So Bayh was like the a lot of new young cadres of people came in the Kennedy administration. And Bayh was Bayh was a liberal Democrat. He really saw a role in government actually fostering development, being more aggressive. And he and Dole opposed each other. I mean, the thing about it was if you're in the Senate for very long, and I worked for Senator Bayh from about 1977 to 80. So he'd been in office like 15 years before I got there. In the Senate, you pretty much realize pretty quickly who are the serious people you can do business with, and they call who are the show horses, who are the workhorses. Bayh and Dole were workhorses. And the other thing in the Senate is you don't have contracts here. If you and I are talking and I agree to do something, and you take my word for it, and I don't do it, you can't sue me, but you're not going to work with me again. So Bayh and Dole were viewed in their own caucus in the Republican Party. Dole was an icon, war hero, guy who got things done, a leader in the Senate Judiciary Committee, went on to be the majority leader of the whole Senate. And Bayh was one of the people who, again, was a Kennedy Democrat, a guy who did his homework, who actually had two amendments to the Constitution, came up with Title IX. He was a guy who was a thought leader, but also could work with people. The other thing was Bayh and Dole were both respected by people on the other side of the aisle. If you went to Bob Dole and you made a deal, that deal was golden. You didn't have to worry about what was going to happen later. The same with Birchby. So I think you had a combination there of people who represented different political parties, different poles of different parties. I mean, they're not just Republican Democrats, they're actually liberal Democrats and conservative Republicans. And in those days, not all Republicans were conservative and not all Democrats were liberal, but that's another discussion. I think when the combination of Bayh and Dole came together, it was electric because it just didn't happen very often. And the other thing was we actually had university backing of people actually could explain to people, this is really having an impact on your state. So we did our homework. Our bill was written by people who had been doing this for many, many years. And it captured the excitement of the times. One of the first things we did was we had a press conference and we talked about some of the inventions at NIH being held up now because the Carter administration had actually stopped processing waivers. And we had people with burn treatments, cancer treatments. I didn't know this at the time, but Senator Bayh's wife actually had breast cancer. It later killed her. She was actually getting treated at NIH. So she was really, she was one of the people urging Senator Bayh, hey, listen, there's some exciting stuff out here. We really have to make sure people can use it. So I think it was the combination of those two, but even then we just barely got the bill passed. But I remember very well that after our press conference, suddenly the floodgates opened, because we had human stories there. People that, the scientists had great stories to tell. And Senator Bayh was down on the Senate floor doing some work, and I came scurrying in as a young staff guy. And I said, Senator, I got some great news. We just picked up 2 new co-sponsors. And he had his reading glasses on, he kind of put them down, looked up at me and said, okay, who are they? And I said, Senator Kennedy and Senator Thurmond. Well, Ted Kennedy and Strom Thurmond were as far apart politically as you could possibly be. It would be like today if you picked up Ted Cruz and Elizabeth Warren. So I remember Bayh just had this little smile on his face. He looked up at me and said, are you sure this bill makes any sense? And we both laughed because we were just picking up political combinations that normally would never be on a bill together in an election year. And that was really because people had faith in Bayh and Dole as people that were reputable, that actually really were leaders. You've been around the block with these guys, you'd seen them before, and you knew that if they gave you their word, it was golden.
And how much of it do you think was a success because of the staffers in both identifying the priorities that these 2 senators should focus on and doing these backdoor conversations and deals to get sponsors and supporters for this?
Well, the staff is critical. I mean, senators don't get down on the weeds. I mean, Birch Bayh was up for re-election when this is going on. He's got other priorities here. I mean, Bayh-Dole was not his main focus. So the one thing that really benefited me was I was really fortunate to work in a staff there that gave me a chance. I was a junior staffer.
How old were you?
I was probably like 30. But I mean, I'd been on the Senate staff before. Bayh inherited me. I was actually working for another senator. I was a junior researcher. And Nels Ackerson, who was our chief counsel, I did a lot. I was doing correspondence for the committee. It was important stuff. It wasn't legislation. And I actually had an idea that Senator Bayh liked for turning corn into alcohol for fuel, which was a big issue in Indiana. And Bayh got excited about it and became a big part of his campaign. The problem was, since I was on Judiciary Committee staff, as soon as it became prominent, another staffer took it away from me because I was on the wrong committee. And so Nels knew how crushed that I was. I mean, this is like, I thought my big opportunity to actually, work with a senator and do something. And he said, okay, hey, I've got these people coming in next week. You got this patent problem. Why don't you sit in the meeting? Well, that turned out to be Purdue University and NIH on Bayh-Dole and Howard Brimmer from the University of Wisconsin. And what happened was Nels said, do some research on this, check out what they're saying. Let's make sure this makes sense. We'll take it to the senator. Well, a little bit after that, Nels hurt his back. And he was supposed to give a speech down in Georgia, in Atlanta. And he asked me if I'd fill in. Well, I was terrified. I mean, here I am. I've never really handled legislation before. I'm going to speak to this university group who knows more about than I did. And long and short of it was, Nels actually let me handle the bill. And so I got a chance to work with Senator Bayh directly, who was a wonderful person to work for. But more importantly, Nels taught me how to staff. He says, okay, now listen, they've been doing this for a long time. He says, you ask yourself the hardest questions about this bill you can. You don't take anything for granted. You do your homework. And when we go to Senator Bayh, we know what we're talking about, both the positive and the negative side. So that was a revelation to me because, a lot of times now you just find people just look at things and reinforce their own views. We didn't do that. We said, okay, how can this bill be attacked? What could be the short points? And I really asked our sponsors hard questions, not to be mean, but I said, look, what's the answer to this? And so when we went to Birch Bayh, we used to actually have a notebook, and it had every issue in there we could possibly have. We didn't overload him with it, but if something came up, we had the answer right there, or we went out and found it. And Dole's people were the same kind of way. So, it's good to have a great idea. That's important. But then you need to be able to make sure that that idea actually works. And that means including asking yourself hard questions, because you're going to get asked a hard question eventually anyway. So I think, that made a difference. The other thing was we actually had opposition in the Senate. Senator Russell Long was the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee. And his father was Huey Long, the Kingfish. If you ever saw All the King's Men, that was Senator Long's father. And I love Senator Long. Senator Long was the pre-generation of politicians. He told stories. He was a wonderful person. In fact, he actually said that he actually warned the Senate about actually televising all its proceedings. He said, this is going to change the whole building. He said, this is going to change the way we work. And he was actually out. He was right. Because once you have politicians playing to the TV cameras, it's hard to go back. But anyway, Senator Long was one of the people who really did believe if the government funded research, it should be owned by everybody. And that was a core belief of his. Hyman Rickover, who was the chairman, who was the head of the nuclear Navy, excuse me, was also somebody who believed that. But I formed a really good relationship with Long's staff, a guy named Wiley Jones. And he and I talked together and we represented our bosses. We said, okay, listen, we're not going to sandbag each other. We're not going to trick each other. If we've got something we're doing, I'll give you a heads up. And he said the same thing. And we stuck to that. So, if Senator Long was going to hit us, Wiley would say, hey, listen, I need to let you know, we're going to come out after you tomorrow. So that was okay. We could deal with that. Senator Long actually stopped Bayh-Dole on the Senate floor. He actually stopped it from passing. So it took us a long time to work the back doors. And we had to go through a lot of iterations there. But to bring it to a close, we passed Bayh-Dole in the Senate. We finally were able to get Russell Long. He said, we limited Bayh-Dole to small businesses and universities. His big concern with big corporations. We said, okay, we pledge to you, we won't put them in there, even though the Carter administration was going that way and the House of Representatives want to have big business in there. And we told Senator Long, I told Wiley, you got my word. We will not put that in there. We're going to limit this, as we said. And Long said, okay, with that understanding, I don't like it, but I'll let it go. So it went over to this House side, and the House in its wisdom came up with the administration bill, which is a big business bill. So, and actually we had people that tried to amend Bayh-Dole on the floor from the Senate Commerce Committee. And we sent around a joint letter. We said, we're going to oppose that. We did. We were able to vote it down. But what happened was, as Congress is getting ready to adjourn, this is after the election, Birch Bayh had lost his re-election. We're in a lame duck session. We've only got a couple of weeks to go because they're trying to get a budget done. And any bill that passes has to pass unanimously. So any one member of the Senate can say no, and the bill doesn't even come up. So I finally get a call from the House side, and they agree, okay, if you accept another part of a patent bill, we'll accept Bayh-Dole. So I said, that makes sense to me. I'll run it by Senator Bayh. He said, that's great. So it comes over to the Senate side, and the Senate Majority Leader's office, who is then Senator Byrd, has to clear the bill to see if is anybody going to object to it. And I got a call back a little bit and said, okay, yes, there's an objection. So I assumed Senator Long. So I call up Wiley and said, hey, did you guys object to Bill? And he said, no, it wasn't us. Well, they don't tell you who objected to it. So I figured out it had to be one of the guys in the Commerce Committee who had tried to stop us before. And I went down to the Senate cafeteria and I found the staffer and I said, hey, listen, I just want to tell you, I just heard there's a hold on our bill. And I'm just telling you right now, until that hold is removed, I'm putting a hold on everything with your boss's name on it. So you're not going to pass anything. And I left. And about an hour later, I got a call back that the hold had been removed. And then, so we're getting ready to bring up the bill on the Senate floor. And Senator Byrd's staff calls me again and says, okay.
Hold on. So why did he put a hold on it? Do you ever find out?
I'm sorry.
Why did he put a hold on your bill?
Well, because they didn't like it. They wanted to have a big business bill. So
well,
it's just
they surely would have anticipated retaliation. So why didn't they respond?
Bayh had already lost. Bayh's lost his election. So, we're at the point now where there's, what could really, other than what we just did, which
So he put a hold before he knew the outcome of the election. That's what you said.
No, I'm sorry. Bayh had lost his election. So now Congress has come back into what's called a lame duck session. So this means Congress had to pass a budget before they adjourn. So Bayh is still in office, but he's going to be out of
I
office.
understand that. You walked into the cafeteria, you made a threat, and your threat was credible. So why was your threat credible?
Oh, because they had bills they were trying to pass too.
So correct. So when they put a hold, they would surely have anticipated retaliatory action on your part.
Well, only if I could figure out who did it, because the majority leader didn't tell me who did it. I just made an assumption.
Okay. So there was good guesswork on your part.
Well, I had a small number of suspects, but anyway, to get back to the story, so it would.
Yeah, and we need to wrap up this part quickly because we've got other things I wanted to cover.
Anyway, so we were trying to pass. Now we have to go back and pass Bayh-Dole, and they said they got to call Senator Long's office. So I get a call from Senator Long's staffer. He says, "I got two questions for you. Is it better for you personally, Joe Allen, if we pass the bill? If you don't pass it, you can come back and get a job next year?" I said, "No, it needs to pass right now." And he said, "The second question is from Senator Long. Does Birch really want this bill?" I said, "Yes, he does." So to show you how the Senate used to operate, Senator By's phone rings. It's Russell Long, Senator Long. He says, "Birch, I'm gonna miss working with you, and you can pass your damn patent bill." And that's how we passed Bayh-Dole, because of our good relations with people like Russell Long, who in tribute to Birch Bayh let the bill go through.
Okay, and a lot of useful leadership lessons, I think, in functioning both within an organization like the Senate, but also outside. Fast forward to today, we've got a bunch of other bills that are now under consideration by Senator Coons and Tillis. Are they the Bayh-Dole of the 2020s?
We'll see. I mean, we'll see. I think it's very significant that they've come together. As you know, this whole patent reform thing has been debated very much like Bayh-Dole was. But the key is, can you get something across the finish line? And so I think it's a very good start, because people are looking at Tillis and Coons very much like Bayh and Dole as people from different sides of the aisle.
Do you agree that IP is a nonpartisan issue?
It is it's certainly a hot debatable issue.
And I ask this because compared to when you were working on the Bayh-Dole Act, do you think it's tougher these days or easier or the same in terms of getting a majority behind the bill?
It's always hard. Our system was deliberately designed so it's hard to pass legislation. So anytime a bill gets through, it's hard. And particularly a bill like Bayh-Dole, because that was one that you really had to know what you were talking about, or patent reform. You have to really get down in the weeds on that. So it's always been hard. I think the key is going to be, just like Bayh-Dole, is there a consensus now that our patent system is not working the way it should? To me, that's obvious. But you're going to get other people like some of the big IT companies that see patents as a hindrance. They see small inventors as a bother. So, that, and just like Bayh and Dole, was it going to be big business focused or small company focused? There's always an issue there. And it's not really a partisan issue. It's not like Republicans have one thing and it actually splits up different ways there. But there are huge vested interests in whether this bill goes forward or not. And I think the answer to your question is, the key to the leadership is, well, you have to have a couple things. You have to have the right people in place. You have to have the right bill in place, but you also have to have fortune. You have to have fortune with you. There's a certain, there's the political winds have to be running the right way. As I mentioned, we just barely got Bayh-Dole through. So it's not a given at all. You got a political year coming up. You got all different kinds of things going out there. You got a limited amount of time in Congress to get things done. It's really hard, but I think it's certainly promising to have Senator Tillis and Coons have actually staked out what they have. So we'll see what happens, but hopefully they will be the next Bayh-Dole.
And you really have made a name for yourself. There's no other individual that's associated with the Bayh-Dole and its success as much as you have, and you now lead a coalition. So talk to us about the thought behind forming the coalition, what the mission of the coalition is, and what leadership looks like in the coalition.
Well, it's very much it's very serendipitous. We actually started the Bayh-Dole Coalition to celebrate the law's 40th anniversary, because we thought, well, this is an opportunity to celebrate Bayh-Dole, to explain what's going on there now. So the idea was, we were not going to form an organization. We were just going to have an event in 2020 and just let people celebrate Bayh-Dole, explain a little bit. What happened was, the Bayh-Dole was under attack. You have people that are trying to misuse Bayh-Dole so the government can control prices of anything that's made with federal funding, which is not how Bayh-Dole operates. So the long and short of it was, we sort of got dragged into these policy debates, and a lot of our people that we were working with, we had university members and small companies and large companies and venture capitalists said, listen, maybe we ought to keep this thing going as like an ad hoc group. And so for 2 years, we did that. It was like a club, a club with a little bit of funding. But we said, the story's being misrepresented. That's not how Bayh-Dole works. So actually last year, we finally incorporated as a 501c4. I was actually asked to be the executive director. It's still a very small organization, but just for example, we're putting out policy papers.
When you say who else is part of it?
Well, if you look on our website, I don't want to just off the top of my head, but we have like 45 members, university members. They're listed there. It's public. But what we've tried to do is establish ourselves as not propagandists, but people who are actually explaining factually how the law works. In fact, one thing we just put up is a thing called the digital library, because there's actually people misrepresenting the history of Bayh-Dole and basically saying you shouldn't even listen to Bayh-Dole, which is ironic to me. So we went back, we opened our conversation talking about the 1945 policies. We've put them up on our website with a little explanation so you understand what the relevance is. So we have the key documents leading to Bayh-Dole on our website. So you don't have to take Joe Allen's word for it. You can actually read what NIH said about why Bayh-Dole isn't for price control. You can actually read the study that showed about the 28,000 inventions and less than 5% licensed. And I think that's been a game changer, because if it's just my feelings against somebody else's feelings, well, what do you do with that? But we're saying, no, this is how the law operates. This is how the law was. We actually have the language from the Kennedy administration and the Nixon administration, which is reflected in Bayh-Dole, to explain how margin rights work. That margin rights are designed to make sure you're actually trying to commercialize a product, not so the government can micromanage how you did it.
Let me ask you a couple quick questions. One about margin rights. A lot of people looking at how margin rights have functioned have said that it's failed. And you have margin rights in theory, but they've never really been effective. What's your response to that?
That's like saying if you have an airbag in your car, it's never been deployed, it's useless. Margin rights is a fail-safe. Margin rights means that something has gone wrong. And remember also, when we passed Bayh-Dole, universities didn't have much experience managing their licenses. So margin rights is to make sure, okay, if a university was taken advantage of, a lot of the concern back in 1980 was, well, what if a big company just goes in, buys the university technology for the purpose of suppressing it? In that case, the government can march in, because you're not trying to, in good faith, commercialize the product. Or if you have tried to commercialize it, if you can't meet the needs of a national emergency. It's very specific. The reason margin rights have never been needed is, for one thing, universities are very good on managing their portfolio. They actually have due diligence in there. So if you say you're going to commercialize something by a certain date and you haven't done it, if you don't have a good reason, they terminate the license. The government doesn't get involved in it. So the system is working. There's been one case where the government could have marched in under Bayh-Dole. And that was a case where Genzyme had an orphan drug, was in production, and they had a problem in the factory and they couldn't produce it. They had they had some quality control problems. So the drug couldn't be produced. There was a margin rights petition filed because, again, clearly they weren't meeting the health and safety needs under Bayh-Dole. NIH looked at that, and they decided that it would be quicker to let the company get back into production than if they licensed other people. It would take them years to go through the Food and Drug Administration to get approved to make the drug. but they said, we're going to monitor this. And actually, they were able to import some drugs from Europe in the meantime to make up for the shortfall. So that's why March and Rice gives discretion to the agency. If NIH had marched in, patients would have suffered because they would have had, as opposed to a couple of months of inconvenience, they would have had a couple of years of inconvenience. So to say that's a failure, to me, it just, the people that are saying it's failed are the people that don't like Bayh-Dole. They basically are looking for an excuse to overthrow it. And to me, it's like, I've never had my airbag deploy in my car, ever.
Okay. So leadership then of this coalition, what does that look like to you?
Well, it looks like me and about 5 or 6 other people that helped pull it together. We have, if you look at our organization, you'll see, some of the founding organizations here. We have people from universities, venture capital people, and we basically look at what the issues are coming up, mainly margin rights and price control, and we try to get beyond that and actually explain to people the importance of patents, the importance of small companies, why it's so hard to get things commercialized, that it's not a walk in the park. And I think the reason we've been successful is because we've been able to document, just like Bayh-Dole did when we put the bill in there, that we know what we're talking about. And I don't put opinions out there. I don't say, well, I'm Joe Allen and I think this and you have to believe it. We don't do that at all. We document everything we're saying back to the original documents and saying, this is why we believe this. And I think hopefully we've actually had I think one of our biggest impacts has been talking to the media, who a lot of times have never ever heard our side of the story. What they heard from me before is, well, people are being exploited, the government's paying for all the research and the government should set the prices. And I think one of our most important impacts has been, excuse me, that we're actually getting calls from the company, from media now, actually asking for our side of the story, which didn't happen 3 or 4 years ago. The Washington Post fact checker actually did a story about whether margin rights were used for price control, and he concluded this is a theory which has never been accepted by any court or any administration. So I think that's having an impact.
So I want to switch gears now and talk about the federal circuit, because you're very well known for your work with Byh-Dole. Perhaps less well known, but I think just as important in many ways, is your role in helping establish the Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit. Talk about that conception, how it was executed. I'm sure, again, you had to work with a coalition of people. And where are we today with this experiment?
Well, excuse me. Basically, Bayh-Dole is based on a patent system. And when we passed Bayh-Dole, as I said before, the patent system was really for a lot of people, was really under attack. The Senate Judiciary Committee had not done anything for shoring up the patent system in years. And actually, Birch Bayh was one of the first people that actually saw patents as an important part of the innovation system. I mean, in addition to Bayh-Dole, excuse me, he actually was able to get people to actually go back to and challenge their patents administratively, which at that time we were hoping would be an alternative to excuse me, just for 1 second. We hope that would be an alternative to litigation. But what happened was the Supreme Court had not heard a patent case in years and years. So when Bayh-Dole passed, the various federal circuits had evolved their own standards of patentability. So if you wanted to have a patent upheld, you went to the 7th Circuit. If you want to have a patent thrown out, you went to the 9th Circuit. But what happened was people had lost confidence in the patent system, because rather than having a national patent, you basically had each circuit had evolved its own standards. And without the Supreme Court overseeing them, you basically picked which circuit you wanted to go to, depending on whether you're attacking patent or defending it. So when I left the Senate Judiciary Committee, I ran a small trade organization called Intellectual Property Owners, which is actually still around. At that time, we were just sort of starting up again. And we had a number of corporate members and small business members, and they all said, hey, listen, this is killing American innovation because patents aren't worth anything. We can't invest our time and money knowing that depending on which circuit you go to, the patent could be thrown out or not. So it was one of those situations where I was not the leader in passing the bill. I just basically I was asked, the bill was kind of languishing, and we had a number of people say, "Hey, could you guys help us, push this over the finish line?" A guy named Mike Remington, who was actually on the House Judiciary Committee, was really the staffer who put the bill through. In fact, it's amazing. As a former Senate staffer, when the Senate Judiciary Committee had the markup, they actually had Mike Remington come over and staff it for the Senate, which I've never had seen a House staffer staff a Senate thing. But Mike knew this thing backward and forward. And luckily, we were able to make the argument that it just didn't make any sense at all for the U.S. not to have a reliable patent system. And if the Supreme Court wasn't going to hear cases, we created a new court called the Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit to hear patent appeals. So in other words, rather than having 9 different districts, you're going to have one court there, which is going to decide this, and you're going to restore confidence in the patent system. And that made a huge impact, because Bayh-Dole passed in 1980. The Chakrabarty decision was in 1980, upholding patenting life sciences. Then you had the Court of Appeals pass in 1982. President Reagan seized on that and actually endorsed Bayh-Dole as one of the centerpieces of his innovation policy. So we had the biotech revolution kicking off. When Bayh-Dole passed, we were number 3 in biotech. We were behind Europe and Japan. Once Bayh-Dole started, we started spinning off. Remember, biotech wasn't started by big companies, it was started by small companies and still is. But they had to have patent protection to get venture funding. So it was like a serendipity. We had Bayh-Dole, Chakrabarty, where the Supreme Court actually did make a decision, and the Court of Appeals, and that just came together to ignite American innovation. And we've had a renaissance of innovation unprecedented in anything in our history. What's happening now is the patent system is starting to fray again. You can't get an injunction. If somebody infringes on your patent and you're a small company, you can't stop them from selling a product. We had these administrative procedures, which I mentioned. Senator Bayh actually helped start patent reexamination. Well, now they're being used to bankrupt companies. Basically, I'll say, Daryl, I'm just going to keep filing appeal and appeal and appeal. And how long can you afford to do this as a small company? So I think back to the Tillis and Coons thing, that's a situation today where we have to go back and restore confidence in the patent system, because the people that it's harming are the small entrepreneurs. The multinational corporations, if you have enough market power, you can overcome that. What you can't overcome, if you're the small startup company and you got venture funding, you have to meet different due dates. If you can't protect your technology, if people can just infringe it and say, "Hey, sue me," that's not how a system's going to operate. So,
but moving back to the federal circuit, looking at it as an institution today, are you happy with the way it's turned out?
Well, I really haven't followed it that closely, to tell you the truth. I mean, I'm not a patent lawyer. I think, unfortunately, the Supreme Court has made some rulings which has undermined the circuit. Because when we passed the circuit, the Supreme Court was interested in patents. Well, suddenly you had the Supreme Court get interested in patents, and it actually pulled the rug out from under the circuit. So I think the circuit is, the Supreme Court is obviously supreme, but if the Supreme Court is going to pass things saying, like, for example, you can't get an injunction, what's the federal circuit going to do? So I think now you're back to having Congress having to restore the balance through legislation. The Court of Appeals of the Federal Circuit can't overrule the Supreme Court.
Okay. So South Africa and Japan, you were involved in both countries. South Africa, their version of the Bayh-Dole Act, and with Japan, you're involved in US-Japan Science and Technology Transfer Agreement. Again, a very important agreement. Talk about your role in interfacing with these foreign governments.
Well, the Japanese thing was a little different. What we had was, I was at the Senate, I ran the Office of Technology Commercialization, and under Bayh-Dole, international agreements overrule Bayh-Dole. So if the government decides to give technology away in an international agreement, that overrules Bayh-Dole. And so we were sitting at the Commerce Department one day, minding our own business. It was actually on a Friday, and we got this pending agreement with Japan on science and technology. And we were, it's like 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and it says, if you don't respond by the close of business, this is going out on Monday. So we're looking at it, actually, I was working for Norm Lacker at the time, who was actually the genius behind Bayh-Dole. And Norm says, look at this. They're actually giving visiting scientists from Japan rights to inventions they make over here. And we said that, again, under Bayh-Dole, scientists actually get a percentage of royalties. We don't discriminate between visiting scientists and domestic scientists, but they don't own the invention. So we went up to Secretary, we were able to get a hold of Secretary Baldrige, who just gotten back from Japan, and we explained this. He says, to hell with that. And he actually said, we put at 5 o'clock, we objected. Well, the State Department went nuts because they were actually already getting ready to go to Tokyo. So that went up to the Domestic Policy Council. We went to the White House and we fought it out. And the Commerce oversees Bayh-Dole under statute. That's what our office did. So we stopped the agreement and we renegotiated and said, listen, if you send a visiting scientist over here, we're happy to have them. We're going to treat them very well, but they don't own inventions. They can get a percentage of royalties. So we actually found out the State Department had been doing these things because it made people happy. I mean, they really had no idea what they were giving away. The Japanese did, but the State Department really didn't. So that was one story. Now, unfortunately, the Commerce Department doesn't really oversee Bayh-Dole anymore, which is another issue. So that was the U.S.-Japan agreement.
Just hold on before you move on to South Africa. Did you get pushback from the State Department when you wanted to?
Oh yes.
Yeah. So how did you navigate that process?
Oh my God, this is trench warfare. I mean, I had to go brief the Domestic Policy Council, the Defense Council. We had to mobilize our forces. State Department was, trying to mobilize the White House. This is an international embarrassment. But Secretary Baldrige was a great guy. And he'd just gotten back from Japan, and the Japanese had been very condescending. They said, you Americans ought to stick to what you do best, which is, growing agriculture and maybe it should be a service industry. This is when Japan Inc. looked like they were going to take over the world. So Baldrige was chewing nails, and he was looking to make an example. And I think the State Department was just stunned that anybody would object to this because they didn't, before nobody had even raised it. They had no idea about Bayh-Dole. They had no idea how many visiting scientists we had. It was just something they put in the agreements to make people happy. And so anyway, it went to the White House and we won. But it was a hard fought, it was a nasty battle because the State Department was embarrassed. I mean, they had to actually pull back their delegation, that was getting ready to go to Tokyo. So it was a big deal. These are not, this is trench warfare. There's a winner and there's a loser. This was not, we're going to cut the baby in half. And what changed was we were able to convince the White House, this is a big deal. You're talking about billions of dollars. You're talking about one of our competitors now, which is not cheating, but we're just giving things away to them. And we were able to, and Secretary Baldrige had a lot of credibility. So we got the White House economic people to understand what was at stake here now. Just like we're talking about educating people didn't really know these issues. I mean, visiting scientists really wasn't that much of an issue. We said, listen, we hardly have any visiting scientists there. That's our fault. But there's Japanese visiting scientists all over the place. We value them. We're happy to have them here. But they're sure as heck not going to own inventions made by the US taxpayer.
And what about South Africa?
Well, South Africa was a different thing. I started my own consulting business.
And why South Africa?
Well, I'll tell you. I started my own consulting business, and I got a call one day from the National Institutes of Health. And they said, South Africa has decided that they want to stop just being dependent on other people for all their technologies. And they're sending out a search team to identify the best practice on managing government research. And I'm at a place called Bethesda, Ohio. So they assumed I was in Bethesda, Maryland, like NIH. And so the people at NIH said, hey, listen, would you be willing to talk to the South Africans while they're here? And I said, sure, but I'm in Ohio. So when they were at NIH, we got on the telephone, I explained Bayh-Dole. They actually already knew about Bayh-Dole. They'd already identified it as one of the best practices. So they went back and wrote their report. I didn't think anything else about it. And I guess about 6 months later, I get an email out of the blue asking if I would go to Cape Town. And I was like, I don't really know these people. I've never been to Africa before, but I said, okay, if the African National Congress, Nelson Mandela's party, is interested in doing something, pro-innovation, and Bayh-Dole all go over there. So I assumed I was just going over to talk to some university group or whatever. And I flew like 13 hours. You know, you've been in the air forever. When I actually get to Cape Town, I meet the person for the first time, and he says, "Hey, we appreciate you coming over here. Actually, tomorrow morning you're speaking to our parliament. You're the lead witness." Well, that's the first time I had any idea what I was doing. I mean, I thought I was just making a different, just a talk, but it was really a lot of fun. I love the people. They were great. They'd done their homework, but South Africa had said they benchmarked themselves with Brazil and South Korea. And I guess in the 50s, South Africa was wealthier than Brazil and South Korea. And in the 80s, they weren't. And they said, so this to them was economic survival. And they said, we view our universities as a key, and we need to figure out how we best get them involved there now. And we've identified Bayh-Dole as the best method of doing that. So they actually passed, there is a South African version of Bayh-Dole, which I think is really great. And from what I understand, I think it's doing pretty well.
And do you have a sense of how many other countries have similar laws now?
Well, that's something I've talked about with Autumn. On paper, a lot of them do. But see, the problem is to have Bayh-Dole work, you can't have bureaucracy coming out Bayh-Dole. And I don't want to mention any particular country, but I have been in countries before where on paper it looks like Bayh-Dole works, but you can't get anything done because you have to go through all the bureaucracy. So yeah, I've been hesitant to say these many countries. Russia has a Bayh-Dole Act. Okay, good luck on getting that enforced in Russia. You could find yourself flying out of a window somewhere. So I think we have to look at it. To me, there has to be a criteria there. Okay, you've got it on paper, but have you really decentralized technology? Do you actually honor contracts? Do you have a patent law? Is it enforceable? So, on paper, a lot of countries have a Bayh-Dole Act. I think you'd find actually a smaller number actually is functioning. But I think to answer your question, I think by and large, even China, India are adopting Bayh-Dole, actually looking at them. But they do it in their own model. They don't just plop down Bayh-Dole there, because it has to fit in with it. I was in Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan has a Bayh-Dole Act. And it was really, I love the people there. And I try to explain to them, listen, look at our model, but to make this work, it can't have bureaucracy around it. You have to trust the innovators. You have to honor contracts. You can't go back and second guess everything once somebody makes a decision. People may get things wrong, but you have to let them have the freedom to do that, because that's going to work a lot better than the centralized.
Would you say that's fair to conclude that Bayh-Dole was really created to flourish in democracies, and it doesn't quite work with autocracies?
I would agree with that. I think what you're seeing in China right now is a great example. What's China doing now that they're reasserting communist control? They're cracking down on entrepreneurs. So one thing about entrepreneurs is they're people who basically it's hard to micromanage them. And I think it's a huge mistake on China's part to, again, entrepreneurism actually got China revitalized again. But then they said, these people are getting too big for their britches. They're not doing what they're told. So we're going to put communist, party leadership in all these companies. We'll just take your company away from you if we put you in prison. The same thing that Putin did in Russia. And what's the first thing Putin did? He arrested the richest man in the country. The message is, if he can go to prison, so can you. Well, that entrepreneurism doesn't work like that. And I think that's a saving grace. And the reason why I'm very confident in the future, if we trust our system, if we trust entrepreneurs, if we create the conditions and get out of the way, entrepreneurs know more about what's going on than any bureaucracy is going to, than any central planner is going to. Now, that's uncomfortable because central planning seems like it has a comfort level there. Because but central planning is basically the status quo trying to preserve itself. Who's at the table with central planning? The people who are dominant people right now. Look at the dominant companies 20 years ago. Where are they now? They're not dominant anymore because the market's too dynamic. If you looked at a picture of Bill Gates in 1980, you wouldn't even let him in the front door. You would have IBM people there with their blue suits on and white shirts and red ties. But who actually knew more about the market? And that's really why central planning to me is always flawed, because what you're really doing is you're trying to shore up the status quo. You're projecting the status quo into the future. And the future is way, way, way too unpredictable to have anybody in government. If you were that smart, you'd be running a company. You wouldn't be in the government.
Food for thought there. Last two questions, Joe. Here's the next question. Mentors and mentees. Tell us what mentorship looks like to you in being a mentor, but also reflect on maybe one or two mentors in your own life and how they have mentored you.
Well, no one has ever asked me that before. And that question actually really took me back. I've been really fortunate that I actually had people that took the time to mentor me. I mentioned Nels Ackerson. He owed me nothing. I was just another kid on the staff. For some reason, he liked me and gave me an opportunity. And not just gave me an opportunity, but showed me how to staff. And luckily, I was smart enough to shut up and listen to him. The other thing was two people I met under Nels, so that initial meeting on Bayh-Dole, was Norman Lacker, who was a patent counsel at NIH, and Howard Brimmer, who was a patent counsel at the Wisconsin Alumni Research Foundation. They shaped my life because Norm and Howard had been in the system for 40 years. They knew how things worked. They understood why the old system wasn't working, knew how the new system didn't work. But Norm was a genius. I mean, Norm Lacker really was a genius. In fact, if you look at the Bayh-Dole Coalition, we have a Hall of Fame. And Norm Lacker and Howard Brimmer are right at the top because they recognized why the system wasn't working, and Norm paid an enormous price for that. Norm was actually fired at NIH for supporting Bayh-Dole. Norm actually had to work, after we passed Bayh-Dole, it took Norm 2 years to get the implementing regulations in place because the Department of Energy tried to undermine them. So just passing a law isn't the end of it. And Norm Lacker not only saw the university side, he was the one that developed the Federal Technology Transfer Act, which was Bayh-Dole's for the federal laboratories. And the final thing I'll say about Norm is, I worked at Commerce under Norm. And when we passed the Federal Tech Transfer Act, we had a choice. Norm could have centralized all the licensing under him because our commerce laboratories weren't interested in it. He didn't do that. He said, no, we're going to decentralize it. You need to learn how to do this. That to me was a real test of leadership. It's one thing for me to say philosophically, yeah, we decentralize it, but when the power comes to me, and you could easily rationalize, hey, these people don't know how to license. I'll just take it over, make it much more efficient. He didn't do that. And Howard Brimmer was one of the finest gentlemen I've ever worked with. He was one of the people that started the profession of university licensing. I used to get calls from Howard all the time, and Norm, and I'm kind of lost now because before, when an issue came up, I could call Howard and Norm and say, hey, where did this come from? Why did you do it this way? Well, now I'm the person. And that's why I created the digital library, because that knowledge is getting lost. But I was so fortunate not just to have people that mentored me, but people who, in the classic sense of the word, were real gentlemen. And finally, I'd like to mention Senator Bayh. I was a junior staffer. Junior staffers don't really work with the senators very much. But when I got a chance to staff Bayh-Dole, I was able to actually work with Senator Bayh. And on Capitol Hill, it's not unusual at all for a lot of people not to acknowledge staff, particularly publicly. And that's okay. They're the political people. Birch Bayh wasn't like that. And I vividly remember we were talking to the American Bar Association at one of their big meetings in DC. Huge auditorium. Bayh's talking about Bayh-Dole. He's up on the stage. I'm in the front row, as far over to the corner as I can be, trying to be as invisible as possible. So he's finishing his talk, and he says, now, if you have any questions about this statute, if you have any comments you want to give us, you give them to Joe Allen. Joe, where are you? And he has me stand up and says, here's my staff person. If you need anything, you go to Joe and he'll help you out. That just meant the world to me, because I'd been on the Senate Judiciary Committee for a long time. the number of senators who would actually honor a staffer and acknowledge them like that. But that's the kind of guy Birch Bayh was. Birch Bayh loved people. Excuse me. He loved to promote people. He wasn't threatened by having people around. You had to do a good job. But I got to know him more and more after he was out of office. He was one of the finest people I ever knew. And he was the kind of person, if you were on Birch Bayh's staff, you would walk through a wall for him because you knew he had your back. And for a lot of people in Washington, that you don't always say that, but Birch Bayh was happy to have his staffers go off and be successful in other things. And when you meet a person like that, he came to government for a purpose, and his purpose wasn't just to puff up Birch Bayh. I mean, all politicians have an ego. His purpose was to get things done. He passed Title IX. He passed two articles of the Constitution. He passed Bayh-Dole. I mean, if you look at what the man did, it's astounding. And it was a real privilege in my life to actually be able to work with somebody like that. And I've always been proud to say that I work for Birch Bayh.
And that's a wonderful anecdote on a podcast focusing on leadership. So not just you, but Senator Birch Bayh as well. But what about mentoring others? How have you paid it forward?
Well, I don't want. Other people have to decide whether I help them or not. I've actually tried to treat people the way Birch Bayh treated me, and the way Nels Ackerson treated me. So when I ran the National Technology Transfer Center, we had 100 staff people, and I've tried to go out of my way to give people an opportunity to let people show what they can do. I didn't prejudge people by their educational background or any nonsense like that. I really tried to say, okay, if you can do something small, here's another thing larger. We're going to help you. We're not just going to throw you out there. So I really took my philosophy of management from Birch Bayh. And sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work. I mean, you find people, some people can't handle responsibility. Some people are scared to death, once you give them something, and that's okay. I'm not trying to make somebody do something they don't want to do, but other people can speak whether I helped them or not. But I've really tried along the way. And the other thing I learned from Birch Bayh is everything doesn't center around the leader. If you're a real leader, you're supporting your people. And the time that the leaders need it is when things are going wrong. You step up, you take the hit, you defend your people. Now you hold them accountable. But it's not the kind of thing, where the leader just goes forward every time there's accolades there. So I hope I've represented Birch Bayh well, but that was a huge impact on my life. I was able to work with people, like I said, with like Howard Brimmer and Norm Lacker. I saw how they treated people, and I hope I've been fair to people. And if some people work with me and did better, that's fine. But I'm not. It's up to them to say whether I was a good mentor or not to me.
Well, I'm sure if Senator Birch Bayh heard what you said over the last hour or so, he'd be very proud of you. Well,
that would mean a lot to me.
2023 and beyond, what does it look like for Joe Allen?
I have no idea. I love what I do. Frankly, my goal in life, I'm much closer to the end of my career than my beginning. My goal is to preserve what Birch Bayh and Howard Brimmer and Norm Lacker had given me. And it's kind of scary now because I'm like the last pioneer left. I was actually in the room when we did it. And it's astounding to me to see people misrepresenting consciously what we did. So I'm just hoping that I can preserve and educate people what we did, not propaganda. Here's the facts. We could have done things better. Okay, that's fine. But this is why we did what we did. And we actually have people now saying you shouldn't listen to Birch Bayh and Bob Dole. What do they know about their law? I mean, that's astounding to me. But we live in an age now where, unfortunately, things have become so partisan that people don't even listen to the other side anymore. Like I said, when I worked for Birch Bayh, one of the first things drilled in my head was, you do your homework. If we're getting Senator Bayh into something, we want to know the good and the bad of it, which means you understand what the other side's saying. Don't just dismiss it because they're opposed to us. Listen to what they're saying. Is there something there we need to think about? Unfortunately, that doesn't seem like it happens very much anymore. And so if you don't do that, then you got no basis for working with people. You know, if I'm not even going to listen to you, if you're just evil because the fact that you don't do what I want you to do, how can a system work like that? And you know, the other thing is, Bayh-Dole was working to basically have all the Democrats like Birch Bayh lose an election while we were working together. We understood that. We're big boys. We understood what the game was played like. So it wasn't like this romantic era where everybody played kumbaya and, you know, that there was this magic bipartisanship. That 1980 election was was as hard fought as any presidential election. It was consequential. Reagan came in.
How did you compartmentalize it?
I'm
See
sorry?
these people day in and day out, knowing that they will run basically out to undermine your campaign, or rather his campaign.
Well, that's just the way it is. I mean, it's basically like if you and I are on different teams, you know? I mean, if I'm playing for the Red Sox and you're playing for the Yankees, doesn't mean I don't respect you, but I understand you're trying to beat me. So, you know, again, I think you have to understand what you're doing.
Go ahead.
And I think, you know, we understood that. I mean, it was clear there are differences in the political parties. There are differences in philosophies.
Is there someone or a group of people that would be able to continue your work once you've decided to step off the stage?
We'll see.
Well, Joe Allen, thank you so much for giving us these remarkable insights on your life and leadership and on the work that you've done, the Bayh-Dole Act and beyond.
Thank you for the conversation, and I hope it was interesting.
Yes, thank you.